Christmas Eve, 1881. The snow was falling softly on Tombstone's dusty streets. A rare sight in the Arizona territory that should have brought peace to this lawless frontier town. Instead, it would witness the most brutal night in the town's bloody history. What happened at the Oriental Saloon? The Christmas Eve wasn't just another frontier shooting. It was a massacre so savage, it would make the OK Corral gunfight look like a Sunday picnic. You think you know the story of Wyatt Earp and his brothers? You think the famous gunfight was the end of their war with the Cowboys? Think again. What I'm about to tell you is the story they buried. The night that turned Morgan Earp from a lawman into something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose, and a hunger for vengeance that would paint the Oriental Saloon red with blood. 12 cowboys walked into that saloon on Christmas Eve. None of them walked out alive. And the man who sent them to their graves, he did it with nothing but a Bowie knife and a rage that had been building since that October afternoon when bullets flew at the OK Corral. This isn't just another Wild West story. This is the tale of how Christmas in Tombstone became a holiday from hell, and how one man's quest for justice became the most terrifying night the frontier had ever seen. The setup: Tombstone. After the gunfight, 2 months had passed since the gunfight at the OK Corral. But Tombstone hadn't found peace. If anything, the famous shootout had only intensified the hatred between the URP brothers and the Cochise County Cowboys. The streets buzzed with tension thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone knew the war was far from over. Morgan walked with a slight limp now, a permanent reminder of the bullet that had torn through his shoulder during the October gunfight. But the physical wound was nothing compared to the psychological scars. He'd killed a man that day, Billy Clanton, just a kid really, and the weight of it sat heavy on his soul. Unlike his brother Wyatt, who seemed to wear violence like a comfortable coat, Morgan had never been a natural killer. The Oriental Saloon stood at the heart of Tombstone's nightlife. A palace of sin where gamblers, miners, and cowboys came to drink away their troubles. Its crystal chandeliers and mahogany bar made it the finest establishment between El Paso and San Francisco. But its elegance couldn't hide the violence that lurked beneath the surface. Men had died on its doorstep, and everyone knew more blood would flow before the feud ended. Wyatt owned a stake in the Oriental's gambling operation, which meant Morgan spent most of his evenings there, watching his brothers back and keeping an eye on the cowboys who liked to drink and make threats in equal measure. The Oriental wasn't just a saloon, it was neutral ground, where enemies could sit at the same bar without immediately reaching for their guns. But that neutrality was about to be shattered forever. The Cowboys hadn't taken their defeat at the OK Corral gracefully. Ike Clanton, whose cowardice had saved his life during the gunfight, had been running his mouth around town, promising revenge for his dead brother. Frank Stillwell and Pete Spence, two of the most dangerous men in Cochise County, had been making themselves scarce since the shootout. But word on the street was they were planning something big. Morgan knew they were being watched. Every time he walked down Allen Street, he could feel eyes on him from the shadows of doorways and the windows of second-story rooms. The Cowboys were patient predators, waiting for the right moment to strike back at the men who'd humiliated them in front of the whole territory. What Morgan didn't know was that Christmas Eve would be that moment. The weather had turned cold for Arizona, cold enough that most folks stayed indoors by their fires, instead of wandering the streets. The Oriental was busier than usual, packed with miners and gamblers who had nowhere else to go on Christmas Eve. The warmth and whiskey drew them in, but it also made them careless. No one paid attention to the group of cowboys who'd been drinking heavily in the back corner since sunset. 12 men, all of them carrying grudges, and most of them carrying more weapons than the law allowed. They weren't just random cowboys looking for trouble. They were the core of Ike Clanton's revenge plot. Men who'd sworn blood oaths to settle the score with the ERPs once and for all. Their plan was simple: wait until Morgan was isolated, then surround him and beat him to death with their bare hands. No guns, no witnesses who could testify to a shooting. Just a frontier accident that would leave Wyatt Earp with one less brother and the Cowboys with their honor restored. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated what a man becomes when he has nothing left to lose. If this story has already got your blood pumping, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what happens next will redefine everything you think you know about frontier justice. The calm before the storm Christmas Eve at the Oriental Saloon was supposed to be a celebration. The bartender had decorated the mahogany bar with pine branches hauled in from the mountains, and someone had even managed to find a few strings of colored glass beads to hang from the crystal chandeliers. The effect was almost civilized, A reminder that, even in the wildest corners of the frontier, people still yearned for something beautiful. Morgan Earp sat at his usual table near the back wall, nursing a whiskey and watching the room with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read danger in the set of shoulders and the movement of hands toward gunbelts. 2 months of living with a target on his back had sharpened his instincts to a razor's edge. The saloon was crowded with the usual mix of miners, gamblers, and drifters. But tonight there was something different in the air. Maybe it was the Christmas decorations, or maybe it was the whiskey. But the conversations seemed louder, the laughter more forced. Everyone was trying too hard to have a good time, as if celebrating Christmas could somehow wash away the blood and violence that had defined Tombstone for the past year. At a corner table in the back, 12 cowboys sat drinking and playing cards with the focused intensity of men preparing for war. They'd been there since sunset, steadily working their way through bottle after bottle of rotgut whiskey, their voices getting louder and their jokes getting uglier as the night wore on. Morgan recognized most of them. There was Pony Deal, a wiry little killer who'd been running with Curly Bill Brocious' gang for years. Frank Patterson, a rustler whose hatred for lawmen was legendary throughout Cochise County. The Grounds brothers, Jim and Zoe, who'd made their reputation robbing stagecoaches and killing anyone who tried to stop them. But the man who worried Morgan most was sitting at the center of the group, Ike Clanton himself, the coward who'd run from the OK Corral gunfight, but who'd been talking revenge ever since. Ike's face was flushed with whiskey and hatred, his eyes never leaving Morgan's table. Every few minutes, he'd lean over and whisper something to one of his companions, and they'd all turn to stare at the lone lawman across the room. Morgan could have left. He could have finished his drink, walked out into the cold Christmas Eve air, and spent the night safely at home with his wife. But that would have meant admitting defeat, showing the cowboys that their intimidation was working. And Morgan Earp had been raised never to back down from a fight, no matter how bad the odds. Besides, he wasn't completely alone. Wyatt was upstairs in the gambling rooms, and Doc Holliday was somewhere in the saloon, probably charming money out of some unfortunate card players. If trouble started, help would come running. At least, that's what Morgan told himself as he ordered another whiskey and settled in to wait. The bartender, a nervous little man named Charlie, who'd seen too much violence in his years behind the Oriental's bar, kept glancing between Morgan and the cowboys, like a man watching two storms approach each other. He'd been in Tombstone long enough to recognize the signs, the careful positioning, the casual checking of weapons, the way conversations died whenever someone walked too close to either group. "Maybe you should call it a night, Mr. Earp," Charlie whispered when he brought Morgan's fresh drink. "That bunch in the corner's been asking questions about you all evening." Morgan looked up at the nervous bartender and smiled grimly. "What kind of questions? When you usually leave? Whether you carry that belly gun everyone talks about, how fast you are with it. The kind of questions men ask when they're planning something permanent." For a moment, Morgan considered taking Charlie's advice, but then he thought about Billy Clanton, the kid he'd killed at the OK Corral, and the way Ike had run from the fight while his brother died in the dirt. Some debts could only be paid in blood, and Morgan was tired of living like a hunted animal. "Tell you what, Charlie," Morgan said, his voice carrying just far enough for the cowboys to hear. "Why don't you bring those boys in the corner a bottle of your best whiskey? Tell them it's a Christmas present from Morgan Earp." The saloon went dead quiet. Every conversation stopped, every glass froze halfway to lips, every card player looked up from their hands. The only sound was the soft tinkling of the glass beads hanging from the chandeliers, stirred by the heat rising from the crowd. Ike Clanton stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor like fingernails on a coffin lid. His hand rested on the butt of his Colt, but he didn't draw. "Not yet. That's mighty generous of you, Earp," Ike called across the silent room. "But we've got all the whiskey we need. What we're really thirsty for is justice." Morgan finished his drink in one swallow and set the glass down on the table with deliberate care. When he stood up, every man in the saloon could see the ivory-handled Bowie knife hanging from his belt alongside his revolver, a blade that had been in his family for 3 generations, sharp enough to shave with and long enough to reach a man's heart. "Justice." Morgan's voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Funny thing about justice, Ike, sometimes it comes looking for you whether you're ready or not. That's when the lights went out. The dance of death begins. The sudden darkness wasn't an accident. One of the cowboys had been positioned near the gas valves that fed the Oriental's chandeliers, and when Ike gave the signal, He'd turned them off with practiced efficiency. The saloon plunged into blackness, so complete that men couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. But Morgan Earp had been expecting treachery. The moment the lights died, he was moving, rolling away from his table, and drawing both his revolver and his Bowie knife in one fluid motion. 20 years of frontier living had taught him that in a fight, the man who moved first usually lived longest. The sound of chairs, scraping and boots, scuffling filled the darkness as the cowboys spread out to surround their target. They'd planned this carefully, 12 men against one, in pitch blackness where Morgan's famous quick draw wouldn't matter. It should have been easy, but they'd made their first fatal mistake by assuming Morgan would panic in the dark. Instead, he'd become something else entirely, something that belonged more to the Apache warriors who'd raised hell in these mountains than to the civilized lawmen who tried to keep peace in frontier towns. In the darkness, Morgan Earp transformed from a sheriff into a hunter, and the cowboys had just become his prey. The first scream came from near the bar, where Pony Deal had been trying to flank Morgan's last known position. The sound was cut short by the wet thud of steel finding flesh, followed by the crash of a body hitting the floor. The cowboys had drawn first blood at the OK Corral. But tonight, Morgan would finish what they'd started. "Where is he?" someone whispered in the darkness. The answer came in the form of another scream, this one from the opposite side of the room. Frank Patterson's voice rose to a shriek that echoed off the saloon's walls, before dying in a gurgle of blood and terror. Chaos erupted as the remaining cowboys began firing blindly into the darkness, their muzzle flashes providing brief, terrifying glimpses of overturned tables and frightened faces. But their shots were hitting nothing but shadows and furniture. Morgan had learned long ago that in a close-quarters fight, a knife was often more deadly than a gun, silent, quick, and impossible to miss at arm's length. The third man died, trying to reach the door. Jim Grounds never made it halfway across the room before Morgan's blade found the gap between his ribs, sliding between bones with the precision of a surgeon and the force of a sledgehammer. The cowboy dropped without a sound, his unfired pistol clattering across the wooden floor. "He's got a knife." Ike Clanton's voice cracked with panic. "Spread out. Don't let him get close." But in the cramped confines of the Oriental's main room, there was nowhere to spread out to. The cowboys found themselves stumbling over chairs and tables, colliding with each other in the darkness, their panic making them easy targets for a man who moved through the chaos like a ghost. Morgan had found his rhythm now, the deadly dance that his grandfather had learned fighting Comanches in Texas, and his father had perfected during the Mexican War. It wasn't about strength or speed, it was about patience, positioning, and the kind of killer instinct that civilized men tried to pretend they didn't possess. Zewing Grounds died trying to avenge his brother, his throat opened by a blade that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The wet sound of his death rattle mixed with the panicked breathing of the surviving cowboys, creating a symphony of terror that would haunt the Oriental Saloon for years to come. "Light the lamps," someone screamed. "For God's sake, light the lamps." But Charlie the bartender was long gone, fled through the back door the moment the shooting started. The other patrons had either escaped or were hiding under tables, praying that the nightmare would end before they became part of it. That's when Morgan made his only mistake of the night. In the darkness, reaching for what he thought was another cowboy, his hand found instead the arm of a terrified miner who'd been too drunk to run when the trouble started. The man's scream of fear was so genuine, so different from the death cries of the cowboys, that Morgan hesitated for just a moment. It was enough. Ike Clanton, following the sound, managed to get off a shot that grazed Morgan's left shoulder, spinning him around and sending his revolver skittering across the floor. For the first time since the lights went out, the advantage shifted to the cowboys, but wounded and disarmed. Morgan Earp was still the most dangerous man in that room. This is where things get absolutely insane. Hit that like button if you're on the edge of your seat, and let me know in the comments, have you ever heard a more brutal tale of frontier revenge? Because what Morgan does next will go down as the most savage display of knife fighting in Wild West history. The butcher's work blood loss should have slowed Morgan down. The bullet graze on his shoulder burned like fire, and he could feel warm wetness soaking through his shirt. But instead of weakening him, the wound seemed to unlock something primal, something that had been sleeping in his soul since the gunfight at the OK Corral. In the absolute darkness of the Oriental Saloon, Morgan Earp stopped being a lawman and became pure predator. The remaining cowboys could hear him moving, but they couldn't track him. He'd learned from Apache scouts how to place his feet so they made no sound. how to control his breathing so it wouldn't give away his position, how to use darkness as a weapon more deadly than any gun. What the cowboys heard was their own panicked breathing, their own hearts hammering against their ribs, their own death approaching on silent feet. The sixth man died badly. Tom Grounds, the youngest of the Grounds brothers, had been trying to reach the stairs to the gambling rooms when Morgan's Bowie knife found him. But this wasn't a quick kill like the others. This was personal. Payback for every threat the cowboys had made against the URP family since the OK Corral. The blade went in low, just above the kidney, angled upward to find the heart. But Morgan didn't push it all the way in. Instead, he twisted it slowly, letting Tom Grounds feel every inch of steel as it carved through muscle and organ. The cowboy's scream started as a roar of pain and ended as a whisper of despair. "Please," Tom gasped in the darkness. "Please, I got a wife." "So, did Billy Clanton's mother," Morgan whispered back, his voice cold as winter wind. "Your brothers made her a widow." The knife finished its work with surgical precision. Ike Clanton was crying now, blubbering prayers and curses in equal measure as he stumbled around in the darkness, trying to find a way out of the slaughterhouse. The Oriental had become 6 of his men were dead, and he could hear the others whimpering like wounded animals as they tried to hide behind overturned tables and chairs. But there was nowhere to hide from Morgan Earp. The 7th death was almost artistic in its brutality. Frank Patterson, the rustler who'd bragged about killing lawmen across 3 territories, found himself cornered near the piano. Morgan came at him from behind, one hand clamping over his mouth to muffle his screams, the other driving the Bowie knife up under his ribcage with enough force to lift him off his feet. "This is for Virgil," Morgan whispered as Patterson's life leaked out through the hole in his chest. "This is for every threat you bastards made." The 8th man tried to surrender. Dave Estes, a small-time cattle thief who'd gotten in over his head with the cowboys, threw down his gun and began pleading for mercy in the darkness. "I give up. I surrender. Don't kill me. Please don't kill me." Morgan's response was swift and final. The Bowie knife took Estes across the throat in one smooth motion, opening his neck from ear to ear. His pleas turned to gurgles, then to silence. "No, prisoners," Morgan said to the darkness. "Not tonight." By now, the surviving cowboys were broken men. Their courage fled along with their dead companions. They'd come into the Oriental planning to beat one lawman to death. But instead, they'd found themselves trapped in a nightmare, with a killer who seemed to see in the dark and strike like lightning. The 9th death came as Pony Deal tried to crawl toward the door on his hands and knees. Morgan's knife found him between the shoulder blades, the point sliding between vertebrae to sever his spine. Deal collapsed face first onto the blood-soaked floor, paralyzed but still conscious enough to feel the second blade thrust that finished the job. 3 cowboys left, 3 men who'd walked into the Oriental as predators and were about to die as prey. The 10th man was Johnny Barnes, a young rustler who'd joined the cowboys more for excitement than money. He died clutching a silver cross his mother had given him, praying in Spanish as Morgan's knife opened his chest like a book and read the story of his heart. 2 left, Ike Clanton and one last cowboy, Milt Hicks, found each other in the darkness and clung together like children afraid of monsters. Which, in a way, they were. The monster they'd awakened in Morgan Earp was something beyond their understanding. Something that belonged to an older, darker world, where justice was measured in blood and vengeance was the sacred duty. "We're gonna die," Hicks whispered to Ike. "We're all gonna die." "Shut up," Ike hissed back. "Just shut up and let me think." But there was nothing to think about. Morgan Earp was coming for them, and no amount of thinking would change that. The only question was whether they'd die quickly or slowly. And that choice belonged to the man with the bloody knife. The 11th death was quick, almost merciful. Milt Hicks never saw the blade that opened his throat, never felt the steel that stopped his heart. One moment he was whispering prayers in the darkness. The next he was falling into a deeper darkness that had no end, which left just Ike Clanton, the coward who'd started it all. The final reckoning, in the darkness with a killer who moved like death itself. Ike Clanton finally understood what terror really meant. This wasn't the clean fear of a gunfight, where at least you could see your enemy and had a chance to draw first. This was primal, absolute terror, the fear of prey animals, who know the predator is close, but can't see where the killing blow will come from. 11 men were dead. 11 cowboys who'd walked into the Oriental Saloon, planning murder, had instead become victims of something far worse than anything they'd ever imagined. The silence in the saloon was broken only by the steady drip of blood falling from overturned tables, and the soft whisper of Morgan's boots on the wooden floor. Ike pressed himself against the wall near the bar, his unfired revolver shaking in his hands. He'd had a dozen chances to shoot during the massacre, but panic had made his aim worthless. Every muzzle flash had revealed nothing but empty shadows where Morgan should have been. And now his ammunition was gone, spent on ghosts and darkness. Morgan. Ike's voice cracked like a teenager's. Morgan, let's talk about this. We can work something out. The answer came from right beside him, so close that Ike could feel warm breath on his ear. Talk. Morgan's voice was soft, almost gentle. You want to talk now, Ike? After you and your boys planned to beat me to death on Christmas Eve? Ike spun toward the voice, swinging his empty revolver like a club, but hit only air. Morgan was already moving, circling him in the darkness like a wolf toying with wounded prey. I wasn't gonna kill you, Ike lied desperately. We just wanted to scare you, make you leave town, scare me. Morgan's laugh was colder than the Arizona winter wind. The way you scared my brother Virgil when you had him shot in the back. The way you scared those stagecoach passengers your boys murdered. The truth was closing in on Ike Clanton, along with Morgan Earp, and he couldn't escape either one. His cowboys were dead, his plans were ruined, and his cowardice was about to cost him everything. Please, Ike whispered. I got money. I got cattle. I can pay you whatever you want. What I want, Morgan said, his voice coming from a different direction now, is for you to understand something. You picked this fight, Ike. You and your cowboys thought you could terrorize decent people and never pay the price. Tonight, the bill came due. Ike could hear him moving closer, could almost feel the presence of death approaching through the darkness. In desperation, he tried one last appeal to whatever mercy might remain in Morgan Earp's soul. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about the OK Corral. I'm sorry about the threats. I'm sorry about everything. Just let me live and I'll leave town forever. Sorry. Morgan's voice was right in front of him now, so close that Ike could feel the heat of his body. Are you sorry my brother will never use his left arm properly again? Are you sorry about the nightmares my wife has because she's afraid you bastards will come for her next? Are you sorry about the fear you've spread through this whole territory? Before Ike could answer, he felt cold steel against his throat, not cutting, not yet, just resting there like a promise of what was coming. Here's what's going to happen, Ike, Morgan whispered. You're going to die. But first, you're going to understand why. Every cut I make, every drop of blood you lose, is payment for the terror you've caused. And when you're bleeding out on this floor, you're going to remember that you brought this on yourself. The first cut was shallow, just deep enough to let Ike know the knife was real. Blood trickled down his neck, warm and sticky, carrying with it the last of his hope. Please, he whispered one more time. I gave you a chance to walk away after the OK Corral, Morgan replied. You chose war instead. Now you get to see what war looks like. What happened next in that darkened saloon was too brutal for most people to hear about. Too savage for newspaper accounts. Too horrific for polite conversation, but those who cleaned up the Oriental the next morning would never forget what they found. Ike Clanton didn't die quickly. Morgan made sure of that. Every threat the Cowboys had made against the URP family, every innocent person they'd terrorized, every law they'd broken, all of it was paid for in blood and screams that echoed through the saloon until the darkest hour before dawn, when it was finally over, when the last cowboy breathed his last breath. Morgan Earp stood alone among the carnage he'd created. 12 men lay dead around him, their blood soaking into the Oriental's expensive wooden floors, their bodies arranged in the grotesque positions death had found them. Only then did the lights come back on. Dawn of a new legend. The gas lamps flickered back to life one by one, revealing a scene that would haunt Tombstone for generations. The Oriental Saloon, once the territory's finest establishment, had been transformed into a charnel house that looked like something from the worst nightmares of frontier violence. 12 bodies lay scattered across the main floor, each one bearing the precise wounds of Morgan Earp's Bowie knife. There were no random injuries, no wild slashes, or desperate cuts. Every wound had been placed with surgical precision, designed to cause maximum pain before delivering death. This hadn't been a fight, it had been an execution, carried out by a man who'd transformed from lawman into angel of vengeance. Bob Morgan stood in the center of the carnage, his clothes soaked with blood that wasn't his own, his grandfather's Bowie knife still gleaming in his hand. The bullet graze on his shoulder was the only injury he'd sustained, and even that had stopped bleeding. He looked like something out of an Apache war story. a figure of retribution who'd emerged from the darkness to settle old debts. Wyatt Earp found his brother there when he came down from the gambling rooms, drawn by the sound of gunshots and screaming. The famous gunfighter, who'd seen more violence than most men could imagine, stopped dead at the threshold when he saw what Morgan had done. "Jesus Christ," Wyatt whispered. Morgan looked up at his older brother, his eyes still holding the cold fire that had burned through the Cowboys like a prairie blaze. "They came for me, Wyatt. All 12 of them, planning to beat me to death in the dark. So you killed them all. Every last one." Morgan's voice held no regret, no shame, no doubt. They wanted war. They got war. Doc Holliday appeared behind Wyatt, took one look at the slaughter, and began laughing. The high, wild laughter of a man who appreciated artistry in violence. "My dear Morgan," Doc said, between fits of laughter, "I do believe you've redefined the meaning of Christmas spirit." But this wasn't the end of the story. Word of the Christmas massacre spread through Tombstone like wildfire, and by dawn, crowds had gathered outside the Oriental to see the aftermath. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others out of respect for the man who'd finally put an end to the cowboy threat. But all of them left with the same understanding: Morgan Earp had become something more than human in that darkened saloon. The territorial authorities faced an impossible situation. 12 men were dead, but they died in what was clearly a case of self-defense against overwhelming odds. The Cowboys had come armed and planning murder, and Morgan had simply been better at violence than they were. No jury in Arizona would convict a man for defending himself against 12 attackers, especially when those attackers were known criminals. But the political implications were staggering. The Cowboys had been more than just outlaws. They'd been a political organization with connections throughout Cochise County. Morgan's knife had cut through more than flesh and bone. It had severed the criminal network that had controlled the territory's illegal activities for years. Within a week, the surviving Cowboys had fled Arizona entirely. Those who'd been planning revenge against the URPs suddenly found other territories more appealing. The psychological impact of the Christmas massacre was more effective than a dozen military campaigns. It proved that the ERPs weren't just lawmen, they were forces of nature that couldn't be intimidated or defeated. Morgan himself seemed unchanged by what he'd done. He cleaned his knife, bandaged his wound, and went home to his wife, as if he'd just finished a normal night's work. But those who knew him best could see the difference. The gentleman who'd reluctantly killed Billy Clanton at the OK Corral was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, more dangerous. The Oriental Saloon never fully recovered from that Christmas Eve. Oh, they cleaned up the blood and replaced the broken furniture, but the atmosphere was never the same. Patrons claimed they could still hear whispers in the darkness, still feel the presence of violent death lingering in the shadows. The saloon's reputation changed from elegant entertainment to notorious massacre site. And Morgan Earp. He became a legend that night, but legends come with a price. He'd saved his family and his town, but he'd also discovered something about himself that couldn't be undone. In the darkness of the Oriental Saloon, he'd found a capacity for violence that most men never possess and never want to possess. The Christmas Massacre of 1881 marked the end of the Cowboy Wars in Tombstone, but it also marked the beginning of something new. The legend of Morgan Earp, the man who'd gutted 12 enemies with nothing but a knife and the kind of cold determination that frontier ballads are made of. We're approaching the incredible conclusion of this brutal tale, but the legend was just beginning. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because the aftermath of this massacre changed the entire territory. Drop a comment and let me know. Was Morgan a hero or a monster? Because what happened next would answer that question in ways nobody expected. The legend grows in the days following the Christmas massacre. Tombstone transformed into something resembling a pilgrim destination for those who understood frontier violence. Men traveled hundreds of miles just to see the Oriental Saloon, where Morgan Earp had single-handedly ended the Cowboy Wars. They came expecting to find bloodstains on the floor, bullet holes in the walls, some physical evidence of the supernatural violence that had occurred there. Instead, they found something more unsettling: normalcy. The Oriental had been cleaned and repaired so thoroughly that no trace remained of the 12 men who'd died there. But the absence of evidence somehow made the story more powerful, not less. It suggested that violence of such magnitude could happen anywhere, anytime, leaving no trace except in the memories of those who survived it. Morgan's reputation spread across the Southwest faster than news of a gold strike. The story grew with each telling, as frontier stories always did, but the core remained the same. One man with a knife had killed 12 armed enemies in pitch darkness. Cowboys from Texas to California began avoiding Tombstone entirely, not because of the law, but because of what the URP name now represented. But the massacre had consequences beyond simple intimidation. Within a month, the remaining members of the Clanton gang had either fled the territory or been found dead in mysterious circumstances. Frank Stillwell, who'd been planning his own revenge against the UAPs, was discovered with his throat cut. In a Tucson alley, Pete Spence simply vanished, leaving behind only rumors that Morgan URP had paid him a personal visit. The territorial government found itself in an impossible position. They couldn't prosecute Morgan for what was clearly said, but they couldn't officially endorse the kind of frontier justice he'd dispensed either. The solution was bureaucratic elegance. They simply ignored the whole incident. No official reports were filed, no investigations were conducted, no records were kept. This official silence only added to the legend. If the government was afraid to investigate the Christmas massacre, what did that say about the man who'd perpetrated it? Morgan himself seemed unaffected by his newfound notoriety. He continued his duties as a deputy marshal, continued his quiet life with his wife, continued to frequent the Oriental Saloon as if nothing had changed. But those who knew him best could see the difference. There was a stillness about him now, a sense of coiled violence that made even friendly conversations feel dangerous. Wyatt struggled with what his brother had become. He'd always been the famous one, the leader of the family, the man whose reputation opened doors and settled disputes. But now Morgan's name carried more weight, inspired more fear, commanded more respect. It was a shift that changed the dynamics of the entire Earp clan. "You've become something I never was," Wyatt told his brother one evening, as they sat in the Oriental, drinking at the same table where Morgan had waited for death just weeks earlier. Was that inevitable? Morgan considered this, turning his whiskey glass in hands that had killed 12 men without taking a scratch. Sometimes a man becomes what his enemies need him to become. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a telegram that would change everything once again. Morgan's wife had received word that their father was dying back in California, and the family was called home for what might be their last goodbye. It should have been a simple trip. Take the train to California, spend time with family, return to Tombstone when the crisis passed. Instead, it became the setup for the most famous ambush in frontier history. The Cowboys who'd fled Arizona hadn't forgotten the Christmas massacre. They'd regrouped in California, planning one final act of revenge against the man who'd destroyed their organization. They knew Morgan would have to travel through Tucson to catch the California train, and they knew he'd be vulnerable during the journey. What they didn't know was that Morgan Earp had been expecting them. The ambush came at the Tucson train station, just as Morgan was boarding the westbound express. For Cowboys, the last remnants of Ike Clanton's gang opened fire from positions they'd carefully scouted and prepared. It should have been a perfect killing ground. Crossfire from multiple directions, no cover for the target, plenty of confusion to mask their escape. But Morgan had learned something about himself during the Christmas massacre, something that made him more dangerous than any of his enemies had realized. He didn't just react to violence, he anticipated it, planned for it, turned it into a weapon he could use against those who threatened him. The ambush lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, 4 more Cowboys were dead, and Morgan Earp was boarding his train with nothing more than powder burns on his coat. The Tucson sheriff didn't even bother investigating by now. Everyone understood that attacking a member of the URP family was tantamount to suicide. The train pulled out of Tucson carrying Morgan toward his family reunion. But it also carried something else, the final chapter of a legend that had begun with a Christmas Eve massacre and would end with the complete extinction of the Cochise County Cowboys as a political force. Morgan Earp had won more than a war. He'd won the kind of victory that changes how people think about justice, law, and the price of crossing the wrong man at the wrong time. Epilogue: the ghost of Christmas past years later. Long after the URP brothers had left Tombstone, and the frontier had been tamed by railroads and telegraph lines, old-timers would still gather in the Oriental Saloon to tell the story of the Christmas massacre. The details changed with each telling, growing more elaborate and more impossible. But the core truth remained the same. One man had faced 12 enemies in the dark and emerged victorious through skill, courage, and a willingness to embrace violence that most people couldn't even imagine. It was the kind of story the American West was built on. Tales of individual heroism in the face of overwhelming odds, of justice dispensed outside the courtroom, of men who became legends through their willingness to do what civilization required but couldn't officially sanction. Morgan Earp died in 1882, shot through a window while playing billiards in a Tombstone pool hall. The official story was that Cowboys had finally gotten their revenge, but those who knew the truth understood differently. Morgan had been killed, not by enemies, but by the burden of his own legend. By the weight of being the kind of man who could kill 12 people in a single night and sleep soundly afterward. The Oriental Saloon continued operating until the silver played out and Tombstone began its slow decline into a ghost town. But even in its final years, bartenders would sometimes refuse to turn off the gas lamps completely, claiming that total darkness in that room brought back sounds that had no business disturbing the living. The Bowie knife that had ended 12 lives disappeared after Morgan's death, some say buried with him, others claiming it was passed down to relatives who understood its power and its curse. But occasionally, even today, someone will claim to have seen it in a pawn shop or private collection, still sharp enough to shave with, still carrying the weight of that terrible Christmas Eve. The story of the Christmas Massacre became more than frontier legend. It became a cautionary tale about the price of pushing good men too far, about the thin line between civilization and savagery, about what happens when the skills that built the frontier are turned against those who would abuse its freedoms. Modern historians sometimes question whether the massacre really happened as described. 12 men killed by one man with a knife, in complete darkness, without a single witness surviving to contradict the official story. It sounds more like mythology than history. But in Tombstone, where the desert wind still whispers through abandoned buildings and the ghosts of violent men still walk the streets after midnight, nobody questions the story. They know that some truths are too big for facts, too important for documentation, too real for disbelief. The Christmas Massacre of 1881 wasn't just about Morgan Earp, or the Cowboys, or even the struggle between law and chaos in the American West. It was about the moment when civilization looked into the mirror and saw the savage heart that still beat beneath its carefully constructed facade. And sometimes, on cold Christmas Eves, when the wind howls through Tombstone's empty streets, visitors to the Oriental Saloon claim they can still hear the echo of that terrible night, the sound of steel finding flesh, the whisper of death moving through darkness, the final settling of debts that had been written in blood and paid in full by a man who understood that some prices can only be collected with a blade. Morgan Earp's Christmas Massacre ended the cowboy wars and secured Tombstone's place in frontier history. But more than that, it created a legend that still haunts the American imagination. The story of what happens when justice takes off its blindfold and picks up a knife. In the end, that might be the most important truth of all. Sometimes, when civilization fails and the law proves inadequate, ordinary men must become something extraordinary. Sometimes, heroes are made not through noble deeds, but through their willingness to embrace the darkness that others fear to face. Morgan Earp faced that darkness on Christmas Eve, 1881, and emerged victorious. The cost was 12 lives and his own soul, but the victory was complete and final. The Cowboys never recovered from that night, and the frontier was never quite the same. The Oriental Saloon stands empty now, a museum piece in a town that exists mainly to remind tourists of what the Wild West used to be. But on quiet nights, when the desert wind stirs dust devils in the street and moonlight slants through broken windows, some say you can still hear the whispers of violent ghosts reliving their final moments. And sometimes, just sometimes, you can hear the soft sound of boots moving across wooden floors, and the whisper of steel being drawn from leather, and the voice of Morgan Earp speaking one last time to enemies who learned too late that some men are more dangerous in the dark than they ever are in the light. This incredible tale of frontier justice shows us what happens when civilization and savagery collide in the American West. If this story left you speechless, smash that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Do you think Morgan Earp was a hero who saved his town, or a killer who went too far? Either way, his legend lives on in the ghost town of Tombstone, where the echoes of that terrible Christmas Eve still whisper through the desert wind. The Christmas Massacre of 1881 remains one of the most controversial and brutal stories in Wild West history, a reminder that sometimes justice comes not from courtrooms, but from the courage of individuals willing to face impossible odds and pay whatever price victory demands.